My grandmother Concetta Ferraro built the inn on Vireo Lane in 1962 with money she'd saved working the switchboard at a hotel in Cleveland. And she never let anyone forget that it had been hers before it was anyone else's. I inherited Ferraro House 11 years ago. The same year I started as an archivist for the County Historical Society, cataloging deeds and land grants for a living while running 6 guest rooms on the weekends. People think those two jobs have nothing to do with each other. They're wrong. Both of them are just different ways of proving something happened, and proving who it belonged to. My husband Gareth Kessler is an accountant, careful with numbers, less careful with his own family. He's a good man in the ways that are easy to point to. He remembers my coffee order. He never forgets an anniversary. But he has never once, in 14 years of marriage, told his mother no. I was 6 days out from hip surgery, still using the walker Bowden McRae had shown me how to fold into the trunk of my car. When Gareth sat on the edge of our bed, and told me his parents wanted to hold Grandma Kessler's 100th memorial weekend at the inn. The whole week, he said. 20 people. Mom already told Aunt Rosalind we'd have it ready. I laughed. At first, the way you laugh at something so unreasonable it has to be a joke. He didn't laugh back. Gareth, I said, keeping my voice level because I have never once won an argument with his mother by raising mine. I have 4 paying reservations that week. The Chandler wedding party is booked in 3 of the rooms. I can't just cancel them. You'll figure it out, he said. You always do. That sentence sat somewhere lower than my chest. 14 years, and he had never used quite that tone with me before. The tone you'd use telling an employee their vacation request had been denied. I didn't argue further that night. I've learned that arguing in the moment gets you nowhere with the Kesslers. You have to let things sit, the way you'd let a stain set before you decide how to treat it. Ferraro House sits at the end of Vireo Lane, a white clapboard building with a wraparound porch and a cellar door around back that still has my grandmother's original padlock on it, the brass worn smooth from 80 years of hands. She gave me the key to that cellar the summer I turned 16, pressed it into my palm at the kitchen table, while my mother washed dishes. This opens the room where I keep everything that matters, she told me. Someday you'll need to know where it is. I still wear that key on a chain most days, more habit than purpose. I hadn't opened that cellar door in 3 years. Lying awake that night, my hip aching under the brace in that deep structural way that reminds you your body is still healing. I thought about the 22 summers my mother-in-law Lalura had walked through my kitchen like she owned the floorboards. I thought about my father-in-law Vortigern, who'd once told a table full of guests that Ferraro House really belonged to the family now. As if my grandmother's name on the deed were a technicality nobody needed to mention. And I thought about Concetta, who used to say that the people who write things down are the only ones who get to keep them. The next morning, after Gareth left for the office, I made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop, and pulled up the reservation system for the inn. The Chandler wedding party. 2 anniversary trips. A retired schoolteacher from Pittsburgh who'd booked the same room every October for 6 years running. I wasn't going to cancel a single one of them. I want to tell you about the first time I should have seen it coming, because it wasn't the Memorial Weekend. It was 2 years earlier, and I let it go the way I let most things go with that family. It started with the guest register, the one my grandmother kept in a cabinet by the front desk, leather-bound, every name in her handwriting going back 6 decades. Lalura had asked one Thanksgiving if she could borrow it for a little project, some scrapbook she was making for Vortigern's retirement party. I said yes because saying no to Lalura felt like more trouble than it was worth. It came back 4 months later with 3 pages torn out. Nobody ever explained why. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I told myself it didn't matter, that a scrapbook project probably needed loose pages for something, that I was reading too much into it. That's the story I told myself for 2 years. The second sign came the following spring, when Noctis, Garrett's brother, asked to use one of the guest rooms for a weekend between leases, and stayed for 6 weeks without ever bringing up rent. Citero, his wife, would sit on my porch in the mornings with her coffee like the porch had always been hers to sit on. I brought it up to Gareth once. He told me his brother was going through a hard time. I let it go, because that's what you do when you've decided the piece is worth more than the point. And then for a while, things actually got better. That summer, Lalura started calling ahead before she visited. Vortigern complimented the new gutters without being asked to. Gareth took me to the coast for our anniversary, just the two of us, and for 4 days I didn't think about any of it at all. I remember standing on a pier in Rehoboth Beach, salt air on my face, thinking that maybe I'd been keeping score over nothing. That's the part that still catches in my throat when I tell this story. Not the betrayal. The 4 good months before it, when I let my guard all the way down because I wanted so badly to believe the piece was real. I was still riding that good feeling into the fall, back at my desk at the Historical Society, cataloging a batch of 1890s land grants, when Gareth called to tell me about the Memorial Weekend. 20 people. 6 days. My hip brace still on the nightstand at home. I sat at my desk that afternoon, surrounded by other people's deeds, other people's proof of ownership, and I thought about the torn pages in my grandmother's register. And the 6-week Citaro sat on my porch like she'd built it herself. I didn't say any of that to Gareth on the phone. I just told him I needed a few days to sort out the reservations. That night I drove home the long way, past Ferraro House, and sat in the car outside it for a while before I went in. The porch light was on. Through the front window I could see the guest ledger sitting where it always sat, and past it, faintly, the outline of the cellar door around back. I hadn't opened that door in 3 years. I had a feeling, sitting there in the dark, that I was going to need to open it a lot sooner than that. I need to tell you about the cellar before I tell you about the papers, because the papers wouldn't have made sense without it. 3 nights after Gareth told me about the Memorial Weekend, I couldn't sleep. My hip had stopped aching by then, mostly, but something else was keeping me awake. The same restless feeling I used to get at the Historical Society when a filing didn't match its own index. I got up around 1 in the morning, pulled a robe over my shoulders, and walked out to the inn. Ferraro House was empty that week between guests, the porch light humming faintly against the dark. I let myself in through the kitchen and stood there for a moment listening to the house settle around me the way it always did. Floorboards ticking as they cooled. I still had the brass key on the chain around my neck. I hadn't taken it off since my grandmother gave it to me at 16. The cellar door stuck a little, the way it always had, swollen from decades of Ohio winters. I turned the padlock, and it gave with the same small resistance it always had, like the house itself was deciding whether to let me in. Inside, my grandmother had kept everything in labeled boxes, her handwriting on masking tape across each lid. Tax records. Guest correspondence. A box marked simply Vireo Lane 1962. I wasn't looking for anything specific that night. I told myself I was just checking on things, the way I sometimes did when I couldn't sleep. I found the folder by accident, tucked behind a box of Christmas ornaments that hadn't been touched in years. It wasn't labeled the way the others were. It was cream-colored, soft at the corners from age, tied with a length of ribbon that had gone the color of weak tea. Inside were 7 documents. The first was a copy of the original deed, my grandmother's name alone beneath the notary's seal, dated 1962. I already knew that part. I'd seen it before. The second was something I hadn't seen. A letter from Vortigern's father, Gareth's grandfather, dated 1988, offering to buy the inn outright, twice its assessed value, so that it could pass to the Kessler side of the family properly. His words, not mine. There was no response in the folder. I didn't need one. My grandmother's handwriting was on the back of the letter itself, for words in pencil. Not for sale. The third document was a handwritten letter, my grandmother's script, dated the year before she died, addressed to me. I sat down on the cold concrete floor, my back against a stack of boxes, and read it by the light on my phone. She wrote that she'd always known someone would come asking, sooner or later, for what she'd built with her own hands and her own name. She wrote that she wasn't angry at anyone in particular, that people rarely are cruel on purpose. They simply forget, over enough years, that something was never theirs to begin with. At the bottom, she'd written one line I recognized instantly, because she used to say it to me at the front desk every night before closing. Write it down. Every single time. I sat there a long while after I finished reading, the cellar cold around me, that letter in my hands. I didn't cry, though I thought I might. I felt something colder than that. Something closer to clarity. Behind the letter were 4 more documents, and these were the ones that changed everything. Bank statements, mine going back 3 years, showing wire transfers out of the inn's operating account. Small amounts at first, $400 here, $600 there, always memoed the same way. Family loan. I'd never authorized a single one of them. I photographed every page with my phone before I left the cellar that night. The flash bouncing off the concrete walls, my hands steady in a way I didn't expect them to be. I locked the padlock behind me and walked back to the house in the dark, the key cold against my collarbone. What I found out over the following week took some sorting to fully understand, and I want to walk you through it the way I walk through it myself, one piece at a time. The wire transfers had started 2 years earlier, the same year the guest register went missing its 3 pages. Small amounts, always under $1,000, always memoed the same 2 words. I went back through the inn's bank records myself, the way I'd catalog a set of land grants at work, methodically, one document against another, until the pattern was undeniable. 26 transfers over 2 years. $14,100 total. Every single one authorized by a signature that was supposed to be mine. I've been an archivist for 11 years. I know what my own signature looks like, and I know what a forgery looks like when someone's tried to copy it in a hurry. I called Saskia Whitmore the next morning, the attorney who'd handled my grandmother's estate. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 4 years, not since the estate closed, but she remembered me right away. Remembered the jar of fig preserves I'd brought to her office out of gratitude. I told her everything. The memorial weekend. The folder in the cellar. The transfers. She listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, letting me talk myself all the way to the point. Whose name is on the operating account? She asked finally. Mine, I said. Only mine. And whose signature was used to authorize the transfers? Also mine. Except I never signed them. There was a pause on the line, the kind that told me she was already thinking 3 steps ahead of me. Cosima, that's not a family disagreement anymore, she said. That's forgery. I need you to bring me everything you photographed, and I need you to stop discussing any of this with your husband's family until we've had a chance to look at it properly. I don't want this to become something ugly, I told her. It already has a shape, whether you name it or not, she said. Naming it just means you get to decide what happens next instead of someone else deciding for you. I drove to her office that afternoon with my phone full of photographs and my grandmother's letter folded into my coat pocket. Saskia's office smelled like the same cedar bookshelves I remembered from 4 years earlier. She read through everything twice, laid the bank statements side by side with a sample of my actual signature from an old contract, and set her pen down when she finished. This is going to take some time to sort through properly, she said, but I want to be honest with you about what I'm seeing. The transfers show a pattern. The signatures don't match. And the letter from your grandmother, while it won't hold up as evidence on its own, tells me she saw something like this coming. What do I do about the memorial weekend? I asked. You do exactly what your grandmother would have done, she said. You keep records. You don't confront anyone yet. And you decide, on your own timeline, when you're ready to show them what you found. I drove home that evening with the folder locked in my glove box, past the turnoff for Ferraro House, all the way out to the reservoir where Gareth and I used to park in the years before we were married. I sat there for a long time watching the water go dark, thinking about Citaro on my porch for 6 weeks without paying rent, about the 3 torn pages from a register that had survived 60 years intact until Allura borrowed it for a scrapbook. I thought about the 4 good months the summer before, the ones where I'd let my guard down because the peace felt so real. I understood, sitting there, that the peace had been real. That was the part that hurt the most. It just hadn't been honest. I didn't cry in the car. I drove home instead, and when Gareth asked how my day had gone, I told him it had been quiet, which was true, in its way. The Memorial Weekend was 11 days away, and I still hadn't told Gareth anything about the cellar, the folder, or the $14,000 that had moved out of my account under a signature that wasn't mine. Saskia had been clear about that. Keep records. Don't confront anyone yet. Decide on my own timeline. So I spent those 11 days doing the one thing I've always known how to do well. I documented. I requested certified copies of every wire transfer from the bank, each one time-stamped and notarized. I made 3 separate copies of my grandmother's letter and stored them in 3 separate places, the way she would have. I photographed the torn edges still visible in the guest register's binding, where 3 pages had been removed with enough force to leave a faint tear along the spine. I also quietly called Lennox Pruitt, who ran the renovation crew I'd used for the inn's roof 2 winters back. I told him I needed a full interior assessment of the guest wing, structural, cosmetic, the works, and that I wanted the crew ready to start the same week as the memorial gathering. That part wasn't a lie. The guest wing floors had needed refinishing for 2 years. I'd simply never found 6 uninterrupted days to let a crew work without a paying guest underfoot. Lennox said he could have a 3-person team there within the week, and that the work, done properly, would take about 6 days. 6 days. The exact length of the Memorial Weekend. I called my insurance agent next, who confirmed that my policy on the inn included a standard occupancy clause during active renovation work. No guests, family or otherwise, permitted on the premises during floor refinishing and structural assessment, for liability reasons. I had the clause read back to me twice. I want to be honest about something here, the same way I was honest with Saskia. I wasn't plotting revenge. It would be easy to tell this part of the story as though I'd sat in that cellar and started scheming, but that isn't what happened. I was tired, and I was finally done pretending the exhaustion wasn't real. And somewhere in the space between those 2 things, a plan started to take shape on its own. Gareth mentioned the Memorial Weekend twice more that week, each time a little more clipped than the last. His mother wanted a head count for the caterer. His father wanted to know if the porch could hold that many folding chairs. I've got it handled, I told him both times, and I wasn't lying. I just wasn't telling him what handled meant yet. 4 days before the Memorial Weekend, Lennox's crew arrived to begin the assessment. Real work, all of it, the kind the inn had needed for years. Plastic sheeting went up in the guest wing. The smell of wood sealant drifted out through the screen door. I taped 2 signs to the front door myself, laminated so they wouldn't curl in the humidity. Property closed for scheduled structural assessment. No occupancy per insurance requirements. Contractors on premises. I packed a small bag that evening, my grandmother's letter folded inside a zippered pocket, and drove myself to my brother Maximilian's house 40 minutes away. I hadn't told him everything yet, only that I needed somewhere quiet for a few days. I left 1 note on the kitchen counter at home for Gareth. Nothing dramatic, just factual, the way Saskia had suggested. Ferraro House is closed this week for scheduled renovation, per our insurance policy. Contractors have keys. Please don't interrupt the work, it's a liability matter. I'll explain everything when I'm back. I didn't feel triumphant driving away that night. I felt something quieter than that, the particular calm of a woman who has, for the first time in longer than she can remember, made a decision entirely for herself, and is bracing gently for what comes next. Gareth called me 4 times before I turned my phone back on. The missed calls stacking up on the screen like something building toward a wave. When I finally answered, sitting on the edge of my brother's guest bed, his voice came through sharp, none of the smoothness he usually carried like a second skin. What did you do? No greeting. Just that. Exactly what the insurance policy requires, I said, keeping my voice level. The guest wing needed structural work. I scheduled it. My parents are standing on the porch, Cosima. Aunt Rosalind flew in from Tampa. I understand, I said. I also understand that you told me I'd figure it out, so I did. There was a silence on the line longer than it probably was. Then he hung up. Lalura called next, her voice tight with the particular fury of a woman used to getting her way through sheer persistence. She used the word selfish twice, and I let both of them pass without answering, because I'd learned over 14 years that arguing with Lalura was like trying to hold water in your hands. I spent the week at my brother's house doing the one thing I hadn't let myself do in years. Nothing urgent. I read half a novel I'd started the spring before. I slept without setting an alarm. On the fourth night, Maximilian sat across from me at his kitchen table and asked, gently, if I wanted to tell him what was actually going on. So I did. All of it. The torn pages, the 6-week Citaro spent on my porch, the folder in the cellar, the $14,000. He didn't say much when I finished. He just reached across the table and put his hand over mine for a moment. The way our grandmother used to when she wanted you to know she'd heard you without needing to say so. By the 6th day, Gareth's texts had changed their shape entirely. The first 2 days had been all capital letters and accusation. By Thursday they'd gone quiet and small. Long day. Mom's asking why we can't just stay at Noctis's place instead. I called Saskia that evening and told her I was ready. We met at her office 2 days later. The renovation nearly finished, the guest wing floors gleaming under new sealant. Saskia had prepared a simple summary of everything. The transfers, the forged signatures, the torn pages, laid out the way you'd prepare a report for a courtroom rather than a family living room. I asked Gareth to gather everyone at the inn that evening once the crew had finished for the day. They were all there when I arrived, 12 of them, perched on furniture that still smelled faintly of sealant. I could see the assumption on their faces the moment I walked in. That I'd come to apologize, to explain myself, to be gently walked back into my old role. I didn't sit down. I handed a folder to Lalura, one to Vortigern, one to Gareth, each of them holding the same certified copies Saskia had prepared. Can anyone tell me? I said, my voice steady and quiet. The last time I was treated as the owner of this house, instead of the woman who happens to know where everything is kept. Nobody answered. $14,100, I said. Moved out of this inn's account over 2 years, under a signature that wasn't mine. I'd like to know which one of you can explain that. Lalura's face changed first. Vortigern's followed. Noctis stared at the floor. Citaro didn't look up from her folder at all. I'm not interested in pressing charges tonight, I said, and I meant it, though I watched the relief pass across several faces before I finished the sentence. I am interested in every one of you understanding clearly that this house was never a shared inheritance. It was my grandmother's, and now it's mine, and the money that used to disappear quietly every month is going to stop disappearing. Gareth sat very still on the arm of the sofa, staring down at his own folder, and I watched something happen in his face I hadn't seen in a long time. Not defensiveness. Something closer to recognition. I have loved having this family in my life, I said, looking at Lalura specifically, because some part of me needed her, of all of them, to understand. I have never once loved being invisible in my own house. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Vortigern cleared his throat, and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. I moved back into Ferraro House the following week, walking through rooms that smelled faintly of fresh sealant instead of the usual chaos of a family gathering winding down. The guest wing floors gleamed under new finish. The cellar padlock hung the same as it always had, brass worn smooth from 80 years of hands. Gareth and I didn't have some big dramatic conversation that first night. That's not how real repair works, I've come to understand. It happens in 100 small adjustments made quietly over time, not in one sweeping speech. A few days later, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us, we had the conversation I'd been waiting most of our marriage to have. I didn't know it added up to that much, he said, turning his mug slowly in his hands. Not just the money. All of it. The transfers, the pages torn out of the register. My mother on your porch like she owned the floorboards. I never had to know because you always just handled it. I know, I said. I wasn't trying to make him feel worse. I was just telling the truth, the way I'd promised myself I would from now on, even when it was uncomfortable. We agreed that week on something we should have agreed on years earlier. Any future family visit would require both of our agreement in advance, with clear expectations set beforehand. No more assuming the inn belonged to whoever wanted it, whenever they wanted it. The real test came about 6 weeks later, at a smaller gathering, just Gareth's parents this time, invited properly with 2 weeks' notice. Vortigern arrived stiff and formal, complimenting the refinished floors in a tone that suggested he was trying hard to find something safe to say. Lalura, for her part, brought a casserole dish, something she had never once done in 14 years, and set it on the counter with a kind of careful deliberateness, like someone placing an offering. Partway through dinner, Noctis called Gareth's phone, hoping to invite himself along. I heard my husband's voice shift into something firmer than I was used to. No, not this time. You're welcome to visit, but you'll need to plan it with us in advance, same as anyone else. I looked up from the stove, surprised, and found Gareth watching me, checking, I think, whether he'd said the right thing. I nodded, just slightly, and he nodded back. Later that evening, I overheard him on the phone with his father. This is Cosima's home too, if we're being precise about it. It was hers before it was ever mine. I should have remembered that years ago, and I didn't, and that's on me, not her. I stood in the doorway with a dish towel in my hands, listening to my husband defend me to his father for what might have been the first time in our marriage, and something settled in my chest that had been unsettled for longer than I'd realized. One evening that October, I finally opened the cellar again, alone this time, no urgency to it. I sat on the same cold concrete floor and read my grandmother's letter one more time, slower than I had the first night. She wrote that people rarely take something cruelly, on purpose. They simply forget, over enough years, that it was never theirs to begin with. She wrote that she wasn't betting on the loudest voice in the family. She was betting on the one who showed up, who kept records, who understood that love and ownership were not the same thing, and that a person could hold both without losing herself in either. At the bottom, in her same steady pencil script, the line I'd carried with me my whole life. Write it down. Every single time. I still wear the brass key on its chain most days. Not because I need it anymore. Because it reminds me that the truth always leaves a paper trail, if you're patient enough to keep one. If you've ever felt invisible in a house that was supposed to be yours, if you've ever given so much of yourself that people forgot to ask whether you had anything left to give, I hope this story reminded you that it's never too late to be seen. I'd love to know where this story found you tonight. If you've ever had to hand someone a folder instead of an apology, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one.